Okay, hello and welcome back to the channel. This is going to be an unedited rambling video. The last two of my videos have actually gone down pretty well, of me just talking about something and not having too much structure to it, especially not spending hours of my time editing the video when hopefully what you care about is the content and not the content of my thoughts as a developer and not a YouTuber. So if that's not your style of video, then turn off this video and watch a normal tutorial. But the subject of this video is learning Blender as a professional and moving to Blender as a professional. It's going to be a lot of swapping back and forth between the industry standard compatible layout and the Blender layout on how and what's useful and what isn't useful and how to learn the software basically. Because I think there's a lot of things that people are missing out on. Because if you're swapping to the software just to use something like the sculpt mode, then I guess you don't really care about learning the software fully. So jumping in and setting it to the industry standard keybinds is going to help you jump into the software and just use it without any issues. So you're going to jump in and you jump into the sculpt mode, and then you do some light sculpting for the new cloth brush that you've seen on Twitter or whatever, and then you export that and bring it back into Maya, and you continue to model over in Maya. And that might ease you into Blender slowly if you intend on learning it. I appreciate that this scenario exists. If you want to learn Blender for what Blender is, then by changing it to the industry standard keybinds, you're actually losing a lot of what makes Blender fun to use and a lot of speed. Because if you make it act like Maya, then you don't get to use a lot of the tools and add-ons and um, key bindings which make Blender into what it is, being most useful. So it's just going to overwrite a lot of stuff, and it might make it easier for you to jump in the short term, but in the long term, you're not getting. You might as well just be using Maya if you're going to use Blender for modeling in the exact same way that Maya works, because it can do that, um, but it doesn't have to do that. And I appreciate that there's benefits to all three of the software that I'm going to talk about, which is 3ds Max, Blender, and Maya. I see Maya being a sort of free-form modeling software where everything's destructive but things work pretty well and it feels good to model and UV unwrap in Maya. And 3ds Max I think is good for more technical models um, and it works really well with the modifier stack and especially the edit poly modifier, and everything that you do in 3ds Max is um, as far as if you're controlling it with modifiers and all the options that they give you and the sheer number of them is all really good stuff. But Blender's sort of in the mid zone where it's fun to model in. The UV unwrapping is fun and easy to do, and all of the key add the keystrokes that you use are a lot just make it a lot faster, and it improves your speed, which allows you to, if you're going to spend, if you eventually know Blender and you spend 2 hours on a model, then I feel the speed at which you can create that um, is, and the fun side of it is just a lot better than the other software. For me personally, if you've never used it before, then it can be hard to grasp, and it can turn you off immediately by using right click to select rather than left click, and so on. So we're going to go through all of that. I feel like the first thing, if you're in industry compatible mode, there's going to be a lot of things that aren't so good. And in terms of how Blender works and how I'm used to using it, these things act and work a lot better. For speed, again. So if I'm in the industry compatible mode, I'm immediately used to how I want to move around. which is useful. Although I think if you've used 3D software for a while, they all control differently. So jumping in and controlling certain software in a certain way um, is always going to be different per software, and it's something that you get used to as a 3D artist. It's annoying, and everyone's got their preferred way of doing it, probably the one that they use most, but that's adaptable. And the reason that Blender uses the way that it does is to stop exactly what I'm doing now. If I want to look around this model, then what I'm doing is I'm swapping between the middle mouse button and the left click button, which is me just swapping between them to get to move around. The zooming method here is pretty good, but the main benefit of having Blender in its default mode is that middle mouse button is moved around, and then you're using your free hand on your left to control the keyboard shortcuts. And my index finger isn't moving off the middle mouse button the whole time, which is sort of the main idea behind why Blender does what it does. So if I'm controlling this with only the middle mouse button, then I'm not moving my finger left, which doesn't sound like a big issue, but it's a comfort thing, I suppose. I'm not moving my finger around to control this. I'm using my hand, which is already pre-placed on the keyboard shortcuts over on the left, and that's just a speed thing, right? So I feel like that one you can get used to pretty quick, but it's the right-click select then, which is an issue because it just feels weird. If you jump off from another software, it just doesn't feel right. So the main point of that goes down to the exact same reason, which is if I'm in left select and I want to select this camera, I'm moving around my scene with some speed, and then I've got to stop and move to the left click just to select something that I want. Whereas in right click select mode, I'm moving around and my hand is already in the right. I don't have to move my hands at all, and my fingers are already in the right position for what I'm doing. And when you get used to that, the amount that it speeds you up is actually, you don't think about it because it's muscle memory, but the amount that sort of helps is pretty crazy. And then besides that, you've got a lot of benefits. So if we forget that changing to industry compatible changes everything. So now I press tab and it comes up with this menu, which is very useful for learning. But being on the tab button isn't useful anymore. And I press W, which is what I'd use to press. It doesn't do anything. It changes to the move tool, which isn't totally useful because I've got to press W to move to the move tool, and then I've got to move the move tool with my clicking in the way of clicking, which again doesn't seem like a big issue. But in terms of speed, having this on even regular mode with left click mode, rather than being on the move tool, which I can still access by clicking, rather than being on the move tool, I can actually just press G and I immediately start moving it, which does require me moving my hand on the keyboard, but that's a lot more. That's kind of comfortable anyway. In terms of only having to control with one hand on the keyboard and one hand on the mouse. So by pressing G and then looking down on the bottom row. So by looking down on the bottom row here, after pressing G, I can see all of the controls. And the only reason I mentioned that is because that makes it easy to learn. But the amount of speed that I have by just pressing G and then pressing X, which you can see on the bottom there, is how I can move it on the X-axis, and Shift X to move it on the anything but the x-axis. That style of movement is a lot more automatic and fast. Goes double for actually being inside the. Wait, so I messed this up. So which goes double for being inside this mode. It seems like I've confused it. Oh no, I haven't. Okay. So being on normal right-click select mode, moving a vertex is just super easy. And again, I've still got access to the tool here. It's just not hotkeyed. So if I'm used to moving vertices around one by one like this, then that's fine. And even then, the way that I'm swapping in between edit mode here is with tap, and you got some very similar tools. Some hotkeys are in slightly different order, that is. So hopefully that's sort of starting to show you what you're missing out on. Because a lot of the stuff on the left side of the keyboard when you're in normal Blender view without the industry compatible tools is speed. You get a lot of pie menus on the left side of the screen, and you've got access to a lot of these drop-down menus from the keyboard. And I'm going to explain some of them, which are going to help you learn how to find them and so on in a moment. But yeah, you've got a lot of hotkeys and stuff in this area. Like if I press Shift S, then I get these new pie menus, which are very useful. Which a lot of these different tools go away when you don't know where to find them, basically, because you've changed the keyboard layout. Especially if you're watching a tutorial on Blender as well. So tabbing in and out of edit mode, I think, is one thing. Then also pressing Control Tab to change into any of these modes, which is all the modes. Like if edit mode is my most frequently one I change into, then pressing Control Tab and then even having numbers assigned to these things, which can help you do things a lot quicker. I think that pretty much drives that point home. Having Z as the button to change between the different rendering views is also really useful. I use that for a lot of previews, and for viewport it just makes so much sense. I think the final few things I'm going to mention, I'm going to go through pretty quick as much of the rest of the video, but there are some really useful things that you can do with how you're going to learn this. So you no longer, by using right-click select, if you can get used to it, you don't have access to that quick menu by right-click anymore. Because right-click is select, you don't want to have the menu popping up when you're trying to select. So randomly, it's assigned to W. And that's pretty much the only random key that is hard to find. W is your quick menu settings. But as you can see, every single action has words next to it which tell you which shortcut it is. If I hover over certain things, then it will also come up with this. Press Shift Spacebar or G, Shift Spacebar, and I can immediately get this menu on the left here. I don't use that very much, but now that I know that it's there, which I previously didn't, that's pretty good. It's pretty useful. But I know that G is then grab, and then alright, how do I rotate? Oh well, it's R. So I now know that R is rotate. And again, on top of that, you've got this bottom bar. When I press rotate, we can see right down at the bottom, it says press X, the x-axis. Alright, so now I know that I can rotate on the x-axis. And it says Shift X does some for X plane, which I don't, being new to the software, I wouldn't know what means. So I press Shift X, and now I realise that with the rotate tool, it doesn't seem that different, but Shift X is going to move you along the plane. So scale with S, and then Shift X is going to scale it just on those two axes, which is good. And let's see, pressing it again and having a look. Control says snap or snap invert, and so you can read that. Now sometimes that doesn't appear exactly in the same position, which is just a little bit inconsistent, and maybe they'll fix that in the future. So if I want to inset these faces, well, I'm going to pretend that I don't know what the inset tool is. Well, I know what it is because I use 3D software, but I don't know what the shortcut is. Although fairly easy to guess. I can hover over inset faces and I find out that it's I to inset. So I'm going to press I, and then we can see at the top in the white text it says depth, control to tweak. So I press control, and now I'm changing the depth. Okay, but while I'm still using the inset tool, I also see that it says outset is off at the moment with O, so I press O, and now it's doing an outset, which I guess is different. I don't usually use outset, and then B for boundary, which is going to constrain it to the boundary of the object, or the bounds. I can turn that on and off, and then I for individuals. Now individual faces are going to move in and out. Now I sort of know that stuff off by heart. Some of it I don't use, and any of it like if I didn't read that stuff up at the top, then I can also click on the inset faces page thing down here, and I can turn on all those settings. However, and tweak things after I've done it, which maybe is more familiar to a lot of people. And there you go, that's the full set of settings. And that goes for every tool. So now if I want to extrude this, then, well, you don't get very many options with the extrude. So it doesn't look like there's much you need to do with that. Let's go with a different tool. Oh yeah, the Bevel Tool, which isn't just B. So what am I going to do? I'm going to hover over the left here and find out that it's Control B. So I'm going to press Control B for bevel, and then I'm going to see that again on the bottom there's a whole lot of words for things that I can do. So M is for modes, which seems to change how it's offset by, is it a percentage of what it is, or is it, is it a distance and so on. S for segments, that's useful, although you can also control that with scrolling the middle mouse button. P for profile, which is very useful. Undo that. And C for clamp, which is going to stop it from going too far, and so on. You can read through all that stuff, and that's how that's done. I'm going to press it again and again. You've got all the options right here, which are linked to those buttons as below, in case you need to edit it after the fact. Okay, so that's useful. And then finally, the last couple of things that you need to be able to learn Blender is, hopefully you already know the UI a little bit, but you've got all your tools and options up here, which you can further say, I want to edit the vertex. So I'm going to select the vertex. And I'm going to go to vertex options. Now, initially, I'm not really going to know how to bring that up in the screen here, but I can hover over it again, and I see that Control V. Control V is going to bring up that vertex menu on screen where my mouse is, which is very useful. So rather than going up there and clicking, I'm pressing Control V. And then I can see that there are different things going on. So V is rip vertices. Let's press V, and now we can see that it's ripped. So I'm learning it on the fly, and that's very useful. If there's a really specific option that you can't find, you look through the mesh tools and you can't see it, um, then you might want to just, you're going to have to know the terminology, but you can press F3 and I can type in separate and it's going to come up with all the options. And I can just go, all right, well, actually, I can see the shortcut on the right there is P. So I can either just click it right now and let it do its thing, or I can press P and I'll get that separate menu, which is useful. And I think if you spend some time doing that and you think, right, I'm adding, well, so I just did something then that you wouldn't know how to do. I want to add an object. Well, I can go to the add menu or I can hover over the add. I can hover over the add um, menu over here. Shift A is to add. So I'm going to add what I want, which is a cube. And then we'll get into edit mode. So I'm going to click here. It's not going to tell me actually that tab into edit mode is an option. But there we go, it is. And control tab is to do this. I think that's mentioned in every tutorial, but so it's not completely foolproof, but it's close enough. And what we're going to do is we'll go into edit mode yet, and then I want to grab that. So again, hovering over here, and there you go. You wouldn't need necessarily to go into a tutorial to learn all that stuff then, because if you already know how to use the software, then you're less likely to jump straight in and watch the basics of a tutorial, and that'll let you get by a little bit quicker in terms of learning the software. I'd say look for all these menus up here as well, they're really useful. And yeah, I think that is everything that I wanted to mention. Don't know if it went off the rails at all. Went pretty quick. It's a lot of words to say, but I hope it was useful, and I'll see you in the next video.